Her spirit soars. Her body is holy. Her shadow is enduring. She is sacred. Singularly divine. We call her Mother. Is there anything in the universe stronger than the bond between a mother and her child? It is her divine role from which she can mine courage and strength, but it is not who she is. It is only a piece of her. In a patriarchal society, it is her universal value. It is also the thing that can leave her most vulnerable. There should be no shame in the birth of a child, no matter the circumstances. Regret has value, but shame does not. It is nothing but a dark place to hide sins and sorrows, and sometimes a management tool, manufactured by bullies to cast upon those who know their sins, to keep them quiet. If only the patriarchal colonists who first arrived in Jamestown were not so wrapped up in their superiority over the so-called savages that surrounded them, they might have learned a few things about the value of their own woman beyond the value of their obedience. Before the arrival of the Europeans, most of the North American cultures were not patriarchal, but egalitarian. That means the male and female roles were more partnership-based, with equal labor and equal voices for both males and females, and it was the job of the chief to hear them all. While the men were more likely to be chief, family inheritance was almost always determined as a result of the mother's lineage, not the father's. Ownership was passed through daughters, not sons. When a couple married, the woman remained with her clan, and her husband would leave his to live with her, if he so chose. Child-rearing was not just the responsibility of the parents, but of the clan as well. There was far less social pressure on couples, and social drama around the birth of any child was rare. Any man or woman who wished to leave their partner was free to do so without fanfare or judgment, as long as the woman and children remained with the clan. Any man who dared to use his physical strength against a woman would be harshly dealt with by the clan. In extreme instances, the punishment could be death. Though children needed to grow up fast, it was a pretty secure and trouble-free environment that allowed them to thrive, unfettered and never neglected. If only this could have been the circumstances for our grandmother Lydia Duggar. Our grandfather, Alexander Duggar, was born of Shame in Surry County, Virginia, in 1751. He was the third child of his mother, our grandmother, Lydia Duggar. It was the third time that Lydia was brought to court on charges of fornication and bastardy. Alexander was a bastard. The punishment for bastardy for both men and women was financial, a fine levied to ensure against the possibility of public assistance for the child. If the mother would name the father would be responsible for most of the fine. If she did not name the father, her fine would double. In the course of 3 births and 3 court appearances, Lydia never named the father. The charge of fornication was a charge that applied only to women. Men were exempt. The punishment for a guilty verdict on a fornication charge was public humiliation by a whip-lashing. A judge had discretion to determine the number of lashes and even forego the punishment under certain conditions. The event would be scheduled in a public place where spectators could watch. The number of lashes would double if she refused to identify the father. Alexander was 11 years old, and his older brother John was 13, when in 1762, their mother, Lydia, died at age 35. The same year that Lydia died, a prominent elderly planter in his 70s, named Marmaduke Cheatham, wrote his will. nearly 5 years before his own death. Though there is no record of any kinship between Marmaduke and the Duggar family, in this will, he mysteriously bequeathed a cow and a calf to Alexander's brother John, who was the oldest of Lydia's 2 surviving children. This was quite unusual, as livestock was almost always left exclusively to descendants, not to friends and neighbors. DNA matches support the theory that either Marmaduke, or perhaps one of his sons, is the shadow daddy of John and Alexander Duggar. Lydia was 20 when she became pregnant with her first child. It was the most common age for most young women to marry. So, what could have possibly put this well-brought-up daughter, from a good family, on a course that led her to be tied to a whipping post in the town square, with friends and neighbors mocking her cries for mercy? We will never know for sure, but there are some clues. There is good reason to hope that Lydia had been spared from that brutal scene, as her mother's affluent family, with hopes of avoiding a scandal, might have made an attempt to influence the judge by enhancing the fine and foregoing the event. Many families in that situation would have sent a daughter away to live with relatives, where a widow's story would have explained it all away. It would have been her only hope for a future marriage. But Lydia and her children appeared to have lived with her parents through all 3 births and the accompanying humiliation. The stories of 2 other young mothers in Lydia's similar situation compare a little differently. The year following the death of Marmaduke Cheatham, when our grandfather's brother John Duggar received the promised cow and calf, Lucy Hanks was born to Joseph and Ann Hanks in Richmond County, Virginia. It was also around the time that Abraham Flowers Lincoln, along with his siblings' parents and some shirt-tail relatives named Boone, moved from Pennsylvania to the Shenandoah Valley frontier that would soon become Rockingham County. Lucy Hanks would have been 6 years old when in 1772 Handel and Elizabeth Wentz left Pennsylvania for a farm situated around 10 miles from that of the Lincoln family. In the early part of 1784, 17-year-old Lucy Hanks gave birth to a daughter. Lucy was likely just 16 years old when she became pregnant and was far too young to be a mother. All we know about the father of her baby is that he was a man of wealth and influence, apparently lacking in good judgment and self-control. Women of this era were kept ignorant of such things. They were, however, very well versed in the importance of obedience to the authority of the men who represented their security. While 20-year-old Lydia Duggar may have responded to the attentions of a wealthy older man with at least some degree of consent, it is most likely that 16-year-old Lucy, with not even a realistic reference for what was happening to her, had any ability to consent to any of it. Lucy's parents, Joseph and Ann Hanks, made a bold decision. Their means and status were too simple to take on a man of means in a social environment that would have not favored them. There was only one thing they could do. Within just a couple of months of their granddaughter Nancy's birth, they packed up their belongings and moved their family to the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains that rose from the eastern Shenandoah Valley. There, they could operate a small farm in a community that knew them as the parents of both Lucy and Nancy. 3 years before the Wentz family, who became the Vance family, arrived in Rockingham, where they attended the Peak Mountain Union Reformed Church. With their new neighbors, the Lincolns, Abraham Flowers Lincoln married Bathsheba Herring. Over the next 10 years, and through the duration of the war, Bathsheba delivered 5 living children. Abraham had served well as an honored captain in a regiment of the local Revolutionary Militia in Augusta and Rockingham County until 1789. He had also, on occasion, served his community as a judge, and in 1778, his youngest son, Thomas, was born in Virginia, while his father was in the militia. Near the end of the war, in 1782, Abraham, who had been influenced by the adventures of his friend, Daniel Boone, briefly, moved his family to North Carolina, ending up in Beargrass Fort, Kentucky, located in Jefferson County. Shortly after the Lincoln family moved to Fort Beargrass, the Hanks family moved to Nelson County, Kentucky, near Pottinger's Creek, which would soon be incorporated into Jefferson County. Lucy Hanks married Henry Sparrow in 1791 when Nancy was 9 years old. Henry Sparrow must have known of his wife's predicament over the birth of Nancy, as the couple welcomed Nancy into their home to be raised with her Sparrow half-siblings. Abraham Flowers Lincoln would not live to witness the marriage of his youngest son Thomas to Nancy Hanks at the Kentucky home of a mutual friend named Richard Berry in 1806. Abraham was clearing brush in a field near their house with his sons Mordecai and Thomas, who was probably only 8 or 9 years old, when they were ambushed by a native warrior who fatally wounded Abraham as his terrified sons watched. The oldest son, Mordecai, ran to the house to fetch a rifle, as the warrior was more than likely in the process of trying to capture young Thomas. Mordecai fired one shot and it found its mark, effectively ending the life of the warrior and the siege. This event left a huge emotional scar on Thomas. 3 years after their marriage, Nancy Hanks Lincoln gave birth to their second child, Abraham. Though Nancy encouraged the future president's insatiable need for books and learning, his father Thomas, likely suffering from PTSD, was surly with his son, demanding his time be spent on physical disciplines. Thomas was illiterate. Young Abraham was heartbroken when his mother died in 1818 when he was just 12. Nancy Hanks Lincoln had been highly regarded as a good Christian woman with a big heart and cheerful disposition that everyone loved. But for her only surviving son, she was solace in a harsh world. A year later, Thomas married Sarah Bush, and young Abraham grew very close to his stepmother. Shortly before his death, President Lincoln would share the truth of his mother's birth with a close, trusted friend. As far as we know, our family shares no blood with the family of Nancy Hanks Lincoln, mother of President Abraham Lincoln, but our grandmother Lydia and Lucy Hanks shared a deep shame that would not have belonged to either of them had they been born in a different place or time. While in the surrounding native villages, the birth of a child was always a reason to rejoice, the families of both Lucy and Lydia had to figure out how to deal with the disgrace attached to the birth of grandchildren they likely adored. Neither Lucy or Lydia were sent away, making it obvious that they were unwilling to give up their babies or their families. Lucy was still a child. Did her parents need to rescue her from someone they viewed as predatory? Imagine if the shadow daddies who hid behind their skirts had not been prominent and wealthy. Would it have been different? And why did the Duggar family leave their daughter exposed to the man who had shamed her? While Lucy Hanks was a child, Lydia Duggar was an adult. This has the earmarkings of a stubborn woman. In a forlorn love affair that had no chance for a happy ending, we will never really know. Meanwhile, it was a whole different scenario, with a different kind of shadow family at the plantation of John Wales in 1772. John, the father of Martha Wales, lay dying in the presence of 2 women of his household, his wife Elizabeth and his housemaid Betty Hemmings, pregnant with the last of 10 children she would bear with him. It was not an uncommon thing for a master to have children with a woman he owned, and could easily sell if it became a problem. In fact, it was common enough that a law was passed requiring that the status of the offspring of such unions would be determined by the status of the mother, not the father. The child of a white father and a female slave would be enslaved, with no rights whatsoever to his father's legacy. While our grandmother Lydia may have been tied to a post and whipped in public, the 10 mixed-race enslaved children at Poplar Forest Plantation, well, that was something you just weren't supposed to talk about. A wife would have to perform some serious mental gymnastics to ignore the truth of that. So what must that have been like for Elizabeth Wales and Betty Hemmings to both know they shared John's attentions? Awkward would be an understatement. These 2 women spent every day in the same house. Anyone who knows the kindred mother heart and soul of women knows if you put 2 or more women in a room together for more than 10 minutes, there is going to be some conversation. It could have gone a whole range of ways we will never know or understand. Was John so cold? that he was able to produce 10 children with Betty with no emotional attachment, and what of her? He was likely her only partner. What becomes of something forced when it becomes routine over time with shared children? It might be that she was not the only woman in John's house that did not choose a love match. Though Betty had no choice, the choice for Elizabeth could just as easily have been as much about survival as it was for Betty. As for Betty, she was the second generation of an enslaved family and was herself the product of an African mother and a slave ship sea captain. Every remnant of the culture and spirituality from which she came had long ago been erased, so that her only reference was what she had been taught from her masters. It is not out of the question that the mistress of the house and the servant who had in common the care of a home also had in common a sort of prison. March 4th, 1789. 11 states ratified the Constitution of the United States of America, and a brand new nation founded on radical new ideas of a representative government operated by the consent of the majority of its citizens, with each citizen possessing the power to vote. It had never been done before. George Washington was the president the people chose. Thomas Jefferson, with memories of his beloved wife, Martha Wales Jefferson, hiding in every corner of Monticello, had opted to leave his home, serving this burgeoning new nation as the ambassador of France. He was returning home in the company of teenage Sally Hemings, the 10th child of John Wales and Betty Hemings. Slavery had been annulled in France, and Sally had lived there caring for Jefferson's daughters as a free woman. She and her brother James had both been paid wages and had become educated and refined. Both could have chosen to remain in France, but neither did, though there is no record. It has been said that Sally, the half-sister of Jefferson's precious Martha, pregnant with Jefferson's child, negotiated her return home with a promise that any children of their union would be freed. Jefferson kept his word, and Sally reportedly visited his grave weekly until she died. When we became a nation, Bathsheba Lincoln, widow of Abraham, was living with her son Thomas and his siblings in Kentucky, not too far from where Nancy Hanks Lincoln, just 4 years old, was living with the Hanks family. Patience Robertson, daughter of James Robertson and his first wife we have named Martha, and Epps Gates, son of Edward and Rebecca Gates, were growing up with their siblings in Chesterfield County, Virginia, not too far from where their great-grandparents had first settled. In 1771, our grandfather, Andrew Duggar, had married Ann Proctor, and they had a son, Shadrach. By 1805, he, along with his brother and quite a few of his mother's relatives, were living, first in North Carolina, ending up in Maury County, Tennessee, as a large, well-known clan. The family of Johann Handel Vance was still living in Rockingham County when Handel died in 1795 without a will. There are some stories that indicate his sons had squabbled over the dissolution of his property, with one son leaving Virginia around the turn of the century. Others would scatter after the death of their mother, all but one, our grandfather, Chrisley Christian Vance. His grandson, William Joseph Vance, known as Willie J., was born in West Virginia in 1869 after the Civil War. His daughter, Bess, is my beloved Grandma Gates. It was almost perfect. Our forefathers likely knew. They had created something that would become not an imperial power, but one of the greatest free nations ever on earth. They knew the rest of the world would watch and follow if it lived up to their vision. It is too bad they struggled over the notion that all men are created equal, caving on commitment to the idea in favor of an easier economic system. The people who had lived here before this nation ever began its journey were treated as though they were invading our lands when the land was their home. But what if they had been offered the opportunity to be part of this new idea? Slavery was not new to the world. In fact, there had never been a time in history when it was commonplace. Had slavery not been acceptable in Africa, there would have been no African slaves. Racial slavery paved the way for generations to remain enslaved. That was different. Indigenous American tribes were notorious for enslaving those they captured in battle. They could be quite cruel, especially to the men, who were sometimes too much trouble to keep alive. Most of the enslaved were women and children, and though the process wasn't always kind, within a generation the enslaved would become part of the tribe. What if our forefathers had really committed to the equality of all men? Would that have included women? Would we have stood a chance at becoming a great nation? Maybe it would have taken longer. We don't know. But our forefathers left room for changes, knowing our country would be a work in progress. Where would we be today if they had followed their conscience, rather than compromising their vision over the value of wealth and power? There is still time for us to figure it out.